Hi, my name is Audrey Heffers, and today I will be reading my paper, In the Room Where It Happens, Access, Equity, and the Creative Writing Classroom. 1. Introduction. One semester I was assigned to teach on the third floor of a building. Given the ebb and flow of my fibromyalgia, there was no guarantee on any given day that I could climb the steps. I discovered upon a pre-semester visit to this classroom that this particular building had no elevator. I had to put in a request for a room change with my department chair, who had to put in a request with some office or dean until my course was finally moved to a different building. This was not the last time that I would have to seek a room change either. As the instructor, I had enough power to change the room, but not so much power that one blanket request worked for every semester. What, I wondered, would happen to students assigned to such an inaccessible room who had signed up for my course? Would they be told they couldn't take the course? Would they only make this discovery on the first day of classes? Would the class be moved? In Academic Ableism, Disability, and Higher Education, J. Timothy Dolmage poses the question, could we live in a society in which the accessibility we create for one person can also lead us to broaden and expand accessibility for all? I would further specify this query. How can radical inclusion and access for disabled people transform creative writing education? By putting into conversation the fields of creative writing studies, disability studies, and pedagogy, we might begin to examine how disability and resulting marginalization are treated within academia, creative writing classrooms, creative writing programs, and the literary world. These are spaces which are all interconnected, and they are spaces where ableism is entrenched in ways both obvious and insidious. In The Significance of Crashing Past Gatekeepers of Knowledge, Claudia Gilberg identifies this as, quote, the ableist knowledge paradigm in which academic disciplines exist and keep producing, perpetuating, and endorsing ableism, mostly unwittingly, unquote, which identifies one exigency in bell Hooks's assertion that there needs to be, quote, a rethinking of the ways of knowing, a deconstruction of old epistemologies, unquote. Access to the creative writing classroom is both a matter of equity for disabled people and a potential transformation of the classroom itself into a more inclusive space, one which is more creatively and intellectually diverse in its approaches to literature and writing. Discussions of such access must include disabled writers, students, and instructors. 2. Students. First thoughts about disability in the academy may revolve around student accommodations for test taking and assignment deadlines, but accessibility and inclusion should evolve beyond simple expectations of letters from disability services. In Toward an Inclusive Creative Writing, Janelle Adsit writes that, quote, a critical creative writing pedagogy values flexibility, collaboration, and student agency, unquote. Dolmage similarly frames the universal design of learning as including, quote, varied forms of applied and interactive learning and multiple options for student design, delivery, and expression, unquote, which are driven by, quote, greater communal shaping, unquote. What are ways in which instructors can shift away from rigidity and toward flexibility in the creative writing classroom? How can instruction become more adaptable and student-centered, valuing student agency as vital to the learning experience? In Craft in the Real World, Matthew Salazar provides 14 alternative workshop models, several of which might be useful to consider in this context. Author choice workshops are the most obviously student-centered, as student writers dictate the terms of their own workshop. But other approaches, such as only questions from the workshop, and the observation, question, and suggestion-reliant approach of critical response process workshop, can help to empower students. When relying on observations, questions, and suggestions, it is possible to move away from rigid prescriptive workshop models that honor one kind of learning and one kind of knowledge, models which have roots in what Paulo Freire terms the, quote, banking concept of education, unquote, which only allows students to, quote, receive, memorize, and repeat, unquote. In addition to other benefits, this honors different aesthetics, knowledges, lived experiences, and viewpoints. In making the creative writing classroom more accessible writ large, rather than solely making adjustments for individual by individual accommodations, instructors have the power to lift some of the excessive labor demands currently placed on disabled students. Such approaches to the classroom also have the ability to move toward better overall accessibility and inclusivity. As academic institutions return to pre-pandemic learning models, it is imperative to interrogate our pedagogy and our praxis. What pandemic-inspired pedagogy can instructors implement in the coming years? How does remote learning benefit some students and disadvantage others? In what ways was pandemic learning more or less equitable and accessible than the physical classroom? We can take this opportunity to recenter the classroom not only on intellectual goals or even creative ones, but also on accounting for the humanity of students and faculty. We can reflect on the ways in which there is not a universally beneficial one-size-fits-all model for the classroom or our approach to it. Instead, we can attempt to meet most students where it most benefit their educative goals. In Why Teach Creative Writing, Francis Gilbert analyzes 5 pedagogical models. One might consider the activist model of teaching, for instance, which can acknowledge, quote, creative writing as a way to make people more politically and socially conscious, unquote, which may be geared toward consciousness of disability. Or a vendor-minded teacher might, quote, prepare their students to promote and sell their writing in the real world, unquote. The vendor approach can prepare disabled student writers to envision selling their work as a reality. Janelle Adsit outlined 6 kinds of pedagogical approaches, including professionalizing pedagogical approaches similar to the vendor-minded model, progressive pedagogical approaches, which emphasize, quote, the creative and expressive capacities of every human, unquote, and experimental pedagogical approaches. When students have their writing taken seriously in the classroom, whether it is framed in terms of aesthetics or publication, they are encouraged to take themselves seriously as writers. This needs to be extended to and inclusive of disabled student writers and the writing which they produce. 3. Faculty. It is vital to also consider how disabled instructors and scholars interact with the Academy. In covering the hidden assault on our civil rights, legal scholar Kenji Yoshino talks about the pressure to pass, to, quote, hide his identity from classmates, unquote. But as relevant here, if not even more so, is his discussion of covering. When he describes the pressure to cover as a gay professor, Yoshino writes about how a colleague suggests that there is, quote, a better chance at tenure if you're a homosexual professional than if you're a professional homosexual, unquote, meaning that Yoshino would, quote, fare better as a mainstream constitutional law professor who happened to be gay than as a gay professor who wrote on gay subjects, unquote. There was a similar unspoken pressure for disabled faculty to pass or cover in attempts to be taken seriously as professors and scholars. In claiming disability, Simi Linton writes that disabled people have a difficult time advancing to positions such as researcher because of, quote, limited educational opportunities, discrimination in hiring and promotion, and inadequate support for disability studies scholarship. And due to a lack of accommodations, quote, one seldom finds in one person the expertise of the trained researcher combined with the expertise of the disabled subject, unquote. A faculty member should have full autonomy to disclose or to not disclose their disability as they see fit. However, it may not always feel safe for a faculty member to do so for any host of reasons. In addition to benefits such disclosure may have for the disabled faculty member, there are various benefits for students depending on the instructor's individual academic focuses and experiences. At minimum, students would become aware that they are interacting with someone who is disabled and successful in the field. Additionally, a disabled professor might be more privy to and assigned readings by disabled writers, or they might connect with the student's work about disabled characters in enlightening ways for the student. It would also help to normalize disability as a fact of life, as a fact of academia, and as a fact of the literary community for disabled and abled students alike. When faculty members try to seem like they're not disabled or too disabled, it costs invisible labor, and these emotional and intellectual resources can be better dispersed by the instructor elsewhere. Further, in appropriately inclusive learning environments, openly disabled faculty might have resources and support that they wouldn't while passing or covering. Overall, the COVID-19 pandemic is an opportunity to see more of the humanity in the room, in students but also in faculty. As Bell Hooks writes in Teaching to Transgress, students taught me that it is necessary to practice compassion in these new learning settings. This is a chance to imbue more compassion and more grace moving forward, for students and instructors alike, and it need not come at the expense of academic rigor or creative quality. 4. Literature and literary community. Janelle Adsit writes that, quote, all forms of representation, including literary production, can be interrogated for assumptions, values, and ideologies, unquote. Literature's representation of disability and disabled people can be analyzed as a craft element in the classroom, lowering risk of representations that lack verisimilitude and perpetuate cultural harm. As Matthew Salazar writes, quote, the way we tell stories has real consequences on the way we interpret meaning in our everyday lives, unquote. Literature and the literary community can become implicitly and explicitly places where disabled people belong, which can be encouraging for disabled writers but also enlightening for abled writers. This implicit insistence on the belonging of disabled people is perhaps especially necessary as disabilities can develop at a later point. Abled writers could become disabled writers, a growing possibility in the aftermath of COVID-19. Access and inclusion in the classroom make access and inclusion seem more possible in the literary world. By positioning disability as integral to literature and the literary community, student writers who might later become disabled will be less likely to feel that they cannot exist as a disabled person and a writer at the same time. Ross Showalter writes in Learning to Write My Truth as a Deaf Queer Writer that he initially, quote, regurgitated the stories he'd read before, unquote, and these stories, quote, revolved around abled straight people discovering disability and queerness, unquote. Showalter came to the conclusion that he, quote, had to move away from writing stories that were in line with what people expected, unquote. What effect does it have when readers come to expect what Amara George Parker dubs in Wheelchairs and Wyverns, Where Are My Role Models, their disability take on Chekhov's gun, i.e. that, quote, if in the first act you see a disabled character, by the novel's end they must either be cured or dead, unquote. What ethos does it create when deaf characters seem, as Patrick Thomas Henry writes in Silence is Seldom Still, deafness sound in character and fiction, like they are, quote, metaphors or cheap jokes pining for audible sound, unquote. If space is not made for disabled students and faculty in the classroom, if a disabled student's voice and perspective is not honored in the same way as abled students, and if disability is not framed as an innate part of literature because it is a part of the human condition, then pedagogy and practice in question are both creating exclusionary and elitist environments in which writers hone their craft. Exclusionary and elitist practices have a strong risk of polluting the craft itself, and the nature of how the world is represented in literature. But as Adsit recognizes, quote, literature can forward social change and the transformation of culture. Literary production is a unique means of putting the world into question. 5. Conclusion. In Teaching to Transgress, Bell Hooks argues that, quote, the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy, unquote. Inclusion and access are beneficial for everyone. The university that lists diversity, equity, and inclusion within its mission, the creative writing program that can attract student enrollment by encouraging disabled students' place in the classroom, faculty who are disabled and have that perspective to offer, faculty who are able but can learn from disabled students in literature, disabled students who deserve equitable inclusion in the creative writing classroom and literary community, and abled students who should see disabled writers as their colleagues with much to offer their creative enrichment and development. Hooks further writes that, quote, ideally education should be a place where the need for diverse teaching methods and styles would be valued, encouraged, and seen as essential to learning, unquote. Having lived through the pandemic, compassion and humane practices should become essential parts of our pedagogy. We can no longer unquestioningly ignore such practice in the name of some sense of elitism, objective methodology, or detached professionalism. Creative writing is the study of humanity in many ways, and it seems difficult, if not impossible, to reconcile disengaged and bloodless practices with such a human project.